One of our findings is that very few people, 11% is our number, are getting significant value from artificial intelligence. Now, again, don't freak out about that. It's not that nobody's getting any value. There's lots of value, but it's just really hard to get these sort of transformative, huge, monstrous, anything that the marketing literature will tell you is happening from these technologies. And as part of our process, we tried to dig into exactly your question. What separates that 11% from everyone else? And it'd be great if I told you one magic answer that you just do and your audience could just do, but as always, it's not quite that easy.
Welcome to Becoming Radical, the podcast for creators, builders, and dreamers just like you. What does it mean to become radical in a world of constant change? Hosted by Michael Gaizutis, each week we'll explore the real-time journeys of those rewriting the rules. From untold failures to groundbreaking success. If you're ready to break the boundaries of limited thinking, this is your guide to unlimited growth.
Welcome to Becoming Radical. I am joined here today again by Sam Ransbotham. Hopefully I said that right, Sam, who is a professor of analytics at Boston College's Carroll School of Management. Very, very successful in the world of AI and real-world application. Currently the co-host of Me, Myself, and AI, which I love, by the way, as an actual name of a podcast. And that, I understand, is in partnership with MIT, which is really exciting. It has also been featured in the Harvard Business Review, MIT, and other top journals. Sam, it is so great to have you here. We're excited to share more of your story, what you're doing in the world of AI, and how it could provide some context and application to our audience.
Great. Thanks for having me. I think it's a fun topic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So we had just a couple minutes here to catch up before the recording. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your years spent researching how companies have adopted AI and what you feel really separates those leaders from others when it comes to implementation in the space.
Yeah, it's a huge and complicated question.
It is. Yeah.
Since 2017, we've been doing an annual report, which it combines a survey. We get several thousand responses across the globe, and with interviews with people, and we produce an annual report about what's going on with artificial intelligence in business. And
interesting.
It's really quite amazing. You know, one of our findings is that very few people, 11% is our number, are getting significant value from artificial intelligence. Now, again, don't freak out about that. It's not that nobody's getting any value. There's lots of value, but it's just really hard to get these sort of transformative, huge, monstrous, anything that the marketing literature will tell you is happening from these technologies.
Right.
And as part of our process, we tried to dig into exactly your question. What separates that 11% from everyone else? And it'd be great if I told you one magic answer that you just do and your audience could just do, but as always, it's not quite that easy.
Of course. Yeah, no, it makes sense. You know, in your view, what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of AI adoption in business today? You know, we hear a lot of things happening in AI, right? Especially here in the Bay, probably where you are on the East Coast. But what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of AI adoption as it relates to business as a category as a whole?
I think gray. I'm going to call grayness the misunderstood.
Yeah.
People tend to think of these technologies as binary in one of two directions. Either they go to their favorite large language model and they try something and it hallucinates or it says something bad, and they say, oh my gosh, this is a terrible technology. It's never going to work. Walk away. Okay, so that's one extreme. And then you have the other extreme, which is, oh my gosh, it's amazing. It's going to do everything. I'll never have to work again. It's going to be perfect. Okay, and neither of those end up being true, of course. And so the truth is always much fuzzier and much more in the middle. And so I think those expectations that get set either from the naysayers at one end or the technology proponents, those are where I think the misunderstandings happen.
That makes total sense. You know, we often hear, and we hear this a lot, on the other side of what I do, I also run a digital agency working with C-suite, marketing teams, global teams. You know, we do a lot with respect to large, robust websites and apps, brand strategies at scale. We hear a lot of this phrase, we're using AI. right? We're using AI today, right? What do you think that actually means from your perspective inside of Fortune 500 companies specifically?
I think that's so beautiful. I deeply suspect that many of the people that say they're using AI, if I quick looked at their screen, I'd see an outdated copy of Excel running.
Yeah.
So, that's a little cynical, but there is a tendency. Obviously, the world is very excited about artificial intelligence. And if you or your company are not doing anything, then you're going to feel left behind. So I think there's a tendency to take a little sticker that says new and improved now with AI and stick it on everything. And part of that is savvy marketing, but part of that is relabeling of things that people were doing already. And it's really hard to discern the truth behind it from the marketing.
It is. There's a lot of fluff. There's a lot of noise. But is there a lot of signal as it relates to what's really happening in the world of AI and transformational technology in this space? That's the question. That's the $1 trillion question, right? Looking at how executives and what you've learned, how executives actually make decisions around AI investments. What have you learned so far? What do you think are the drivers of those decisions around AI investments?
Yeah, so I think that's really changed, particularly in the last few years. And what I'll point to is that early on, maybe 7 years ago, 8 years ago, when we started studying this, if we said artificial intelligence, we almost necessitated coding and machine learning models and building technology. And I'm sure the C-suite people you talk to, if you went into a room of people there and said, how many of you have actually yourself touched artificial intelligence? No hands would have gone up 7 or 8 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it just wasn't going to happen. Fast forward up until 2 or 3 years ago. Now, if you ask that same group of people, every single hand will go up because every single person has been able to go online and use one of these large language models from any number of vendors. And that awareness of what it can and cannot do, what it's possible and not possible, I think has been really important for the adoption of these technologies.
Yeah, I completely agree. The accessibility and the extendability of what we're seeing with LLMs at scale, even as it relates to what they're calling GEO now, generative engine optimization versus SEO. Thinking of the future of what ChatGPT, Perplexity, Gemini futuristically is trying to do, at a larger level, appealing to the marketing teams that exist or leadership teams that exist, or regular people that are looking to search and play around. I think that's the total accessibility at scale. And you're right. It's very interesting to see what has happened in a 7-year period up to now. Can we only imagine what will happen in 7 years from now? That's the bigger question.
Well, extrapolation is so hard. I think we as humans are really terrible at extrapolating things. We have a tendency to look at a curve and say, man, that's just going to explode. And, there are different shapes that curve could play out. I mean, one is this exploding curve, which I think everyone's pretty excited about.
Of course.
But there's also the same sort of idea that there are diminishing returns. We tend to do easier things first, and the things we don't do first are harder. And so that speaks to a flattening curve. And so when we think about extrapolating, it is extraordinarily difficult to know, to predict the future, especially about the future.
It really is. It really is. And looking at your own research, do you feel like there are particular industries or even use cases where AI is really having the biggest business impact right now as of today? Where do you see that happening?
I mean, so there's a lot going on. And so there's two different ways of thinking about that. We obviously look at industries, and the technology industries and the technology functions within organizations tend to be leading at these technologies. They tend to be doing the most. They tend to be embracing the most. They like technology, so they do more of them. And so on the one hand, you've got a lot of drive to adopt technologies in those areas. But at the same time, those areas were also places that were early to adopt machine learning and other technologies. So there may not be as much potential in those as there are in other areas of the organization. So kind of flip around, human resources is almost the opposite of technology in terms of adoption for probably many good reasons. But at the same time, so I think they have a lot of potential for adopting these technologies. And so it's an interesting mix of how rapidly places are adopting it, what their opportunities are, what the difficulties they face, what regulations they face. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it's just all over the place because it varies by function, it varies by industry, it varies by company size.
Right.
There are very few sorts of, here, this works for everyone rules with this technology.
That's all true. If we think about the function of HR and where it's been historically, a very human first industry, right? So now with technology layering in, how does that play a role as your example, as this use case into HR? How does it become more efficient? How does it really vet candidates? Because I'm seeing that a lot. I had a colleague of mine who he worked for a startup and he was let go. The startup dissolved. Happens a lot in the world of startups, as we know. And it was a high-profile position, and he was interviewed recently by AI as part of the HR initiative. So it's fascinating to see how AI is really integrating, and when done well, really complementary to the function of any job or industry or vertical within an industry or specialty within an industry or department. It's really fascinating. And I think it will play a role. And the question is, how do we use it to really uncover truths and voids and really improve and enable us to do a better job at something, hopefully in that capacity. That's really what we want. And that kind of brings me back to a question of what role you think organizational culture plays and whether AI initiatives succeed or if they fail.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with your sub phrase there, when done well. I mean, that isn't that the crux of everything? That
yes.
As long as you put that little tagline, well, when done well, then it
when done well, exactly.
It gives you a lot of freedom there to answer that. Now, culture is actually hugely important, and our report a couple of years ago focused specifically on culture for that reason.
Sure,
I think it's natural to first think about process efficiencies or revenue generation or cost savings. When we implement a new technology, these are typically the drivers. We like those because they're very measurable. You can, if you had a process that ran this fast last week, you introduce artificial intelligence and it runs this fast, you can make some ROI calculation really easy. When you talking about culture, then it gets much more difficult because it's really hard to know what your actual culture was before, your culture after. But what we saw in our research was the ability for a cycle to start. And the cycle can go either way. So it's not necessarily a positive thing, but the cycle, the positive spin on the cycle is you get some people to try the technology.
Yeah.
They find that it makes them more productive. It helps them. They get better. They have an appetite for doing more, improves morale, improves teamwork. These are some actual measures that we have from our research. Well, when those things happen, then they're more likely to adopt more technologies. It makes sense. It worked well. You want more. And so we saw a cycle develop that over time, success would lead to more success, more adoption, more success, that sort of benefit. Now, it can go the other way. You put in a disaster, the disaster doesn't go well, people are technology phobic. And so I really think that's a big part of management and the role here of management in ensuring that, or not ensuring, that sounds almost too guaranteed, in doing what they can to help that these wheels get going in the right direction.
Makes total sense. For business leaders who feel completely overwhelmed by the AI hype, where should they start from your perspective? Where's a good place to begin?
Well, there's just so many places to begin, and I can talk out of both sides of my mouth here. So don't bust me on this.
Yeah.
There's something really nice about picking one small thing and doing an experiment. Like before, we didn't use any technology in this process. Afterwards, we do use some technology. What changes here? If you get to the right place, the right technology, the right fit, you have some success.
Yeah.
Now, the other side of my mouth is some of these technologies work really well when done pervasively as well. A great analogy that someone on our podcast at H&M, Artie Zykami, said was, he said, it's like tightening a tire. When you put the lug nuts on your tire, I don't know if you've changed a tire recently, you don't tighten one all the way and then tighten the next one because it'll mount wobbly. Tighten a little bit, and move around.
Right. Yep.
The same with IKEA and their furniture. The instructions say tighten them all a little bit, tighten them all some more, and tighten them all.
And you go back. Yep.
And I thought that was a nice analogy because if you think about, if you over technology one part, then it's going to get out of sync and make your organization wobbly.
Oh, it's a really, really great way of looking at it. It makes total sense. And I think that goes to the concept of how leaders and how you think leaders should think about the trade-off between innovation and explainability when deploying AI. What do you think that should look like?
Yeah, so it's really tough. We'd love for innovation to be a great part of the story here. Innovation is usually paired with the idea of exploring something new or exploiting, meaning doing something you're already doing better. So there's kind of two different ways. And if you think about, you've got $1 and you can spend $1 on doing something entirely new or $1 in making something existing better. I think it's really tempting to put that dollar into an existing process and make it incrementally better.
Absolutely.
Now, that's great. There's nothing wrong with making processes better. Yeah. But the danger there is you end up with a local maximum, not a global maximum. By not sort of trying something new, then you and businesses face that all the time. And I think, there's nothing about artificial intelligence. It's magic. This technology does give opportunities to do stuff in weird ways before. So one of our podcast guests was Stanley Black & Decker. And one of the things that struck me about one of the things they described was that the way the quality control for their, I think it was a measuring tape, if I remember right, worked, was that it was expensive to do. And so they tended to do it at the end of the process because they didn't want to do it repeatedly. What happened was when they had some artificial intelligence technologies like vision and other measuring technologies, they could do it cheaper.
Right.
And so what that meant was they could actually move their QA process to a different place in the production chain. Now, that's different than just applying the technology to make that actual QA process better. It changed their production flow by being able to move it in different places. And I think that's hard for us to think about. You mentioned innovation. There's some great examples that we've run into over time of how companies have used it. But I think maybe the one that hits us all the hardest is Moderna. So we were talking to Moderna about how they were using artificial intelligence. And within a few days of identifying the COVID virus, their AI systems had identified the vaccine that we end up using as one of the possible candidates. Now, it didn't pick only that candidate, and there was still a lot of testing to do. But the point is, it examined a search space and found what kinds of combinations might work and let the people at Moderna go in and say, all right, we need to focus our resources on these because these have the most potential.
Right.
I've had a similar story with Pirelli tires, which is kind of the opposite of...
Great tires, by the way. I had about a little Audi A3. I love those tires. Great tires. Yeah.
Well, so they make new tires all the time, and they have... I'm naive. I thought tires were kind of simple until I talked to them. But then but they make tires out of hundreds of ingredients, and there's lots of different ways to combine those ingredients.
Yeah.
But making a tire is a complicated process, and they don't want to just make all kinds of tires and then test them to see which works. And so again, they're using artificial intelligence to explore that search space to find out what are combinations that are likely to work well. And so they have to make even fewer and put even fewer through testing. So there's a lot of potential for this technology to help with innovation.
Sounds like it. And it sounds like there's a lot of use cases for a lot of different types of businesses and a lot of different types of industries and verticals. That's the beauty of AI. That's the beauty of this technology as we continue to see its shift and change and metamorphism in the market. So it's fascinating. You've interviewed leaders, as you mentioned, some of them, like, people and places associated with Amazon, Levi Strauss, and JP Morgan Chase. What are some of the patterns or surprises that emerged from those conversations that you had with those leaders?
Everybody has an interesting story, and it's always fun to hear about them. And I'm more surprised at how varied stories are. But one theme I might pick out is that it's easy to focus on the technology. And I get it. I'm a technology person. I teach classes in machine learning. I think technology is fun. But you mentioned Levi Strauss. Yeah. They took a whole bunch of people who knew how to work in making jeans or whatever products that they were making and introduce them to artificial intelligence through camps or training programs. That's not the obvious way, because there's different ways that you could take technology people and try to teach them about using, making products.
Yeah, yeah.
What we've found is that organizations, I think United Airlines or Delta is another one, they've done projects where they take people who know business and try to introduce technology to them. As technology is getting more consumable by all of us, the business part is harder. And
Of
so
course.
people are, I think, seeing more success in taking people who have understandings of the business and understanding what the business is trying to do,
Right.
and introducing them to the technology rather than the opposite.
That makes sense. I see that. I think it's really imperative to understand those core foundations, those larger go-to-market strategies. How do we employ the technology versus the other way around? How do we teach the fundamentals, the foundations, the strategies, the nuances of running a Fortune 500 company, let's say, or well-funded VC-backed startup, and then layering in the technology, which, as you said, is becoming more available every day, more and more available, more understandable, more digestible. It's a fascinating perspective, and I see that a lot.
And Michael, I think you're hitting on something that's big here. And one of my co-authors, David Kieran, has talked about this before, is that if you start with the technology, you end up trying to find places to fit the technology. Whereas if you start with what the problem is you're having, what your strategy is,
right,
and then how you can use the technology to help that strategy. On the one hand, it's a little bit of semantics. On the other hand, I think those semantics are pretty big. Yeah. It's the difference between, the whole classic, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right.
If you come in with a technologist, they're going to find places to use that technology.
Right.
Versus when people start from the business problem side or the strategy side, then they're using the technology to try to aid that.
That makes total sense. Yeah, absolutely. You've been running this podcast. How do you feel co-hosting the podcast has influenced your own thinking about AI's role in the world of business? Has it played a role for you? Has it allowed you to see things and digest things differently, to interpret things differently, to understand what's coming or what could be coming from a different lens?
I'd love to tell you that no, it hasn't changed anything because I perfectly predict everything that's going to happen, but that is not the case. Actually, it's really fascinating to talk to people and to learn all the different things that they're doing and how they're doing them in the different ways. People have very interesting stories, and occasionally we're able to kind of learn about them a little bit ahead of other people.
Yeah.
We have a lag in our, we record and then, a month or two before we actually publish because we do some production processes. I'm sure you do the same.
Yep.
But the point is, we're not like a daily news podcast. And so with that, we have an interesting case where lots of times we're talking about things with people before they're hitting the market.
Right.
And so, we've got this lag that we're quiet about them. But I think the best example of that was in talking to Microsoft. They knew that the OpenAI changes were coming with ChatGPT 3.5 at the time we were talking about them. And we got a little bit of a whisper that, hey, something big is about to happen. And it was fun to have a little bit of insight there.
Little inside information. Yeah. Not insider trading, but inside information that could help you understand the bigger picture.
They were very careful about it, but you could see that something big was happening.
Yeah, you could tell. It was obvious. What trends are you watching today that you believe will really define the next wave of AI in business? Are you seeing something that makes you feel like this is what is coming or could be coming? And, we talk to a lot of people here. We've interviewed people that are deep into robotics. We've interviewed people that are deep into coral restoration and using technology there. We've talked to people using technology and AI in agriculture and agri-farming. And there's a lot of different subsets of this industry, or like we talked about HR. Where do you think the trends are happening with this next wave of AI, just from your own perspective and everything you're learning so far?
I think what I'm most interested at the moment at is in the 1990s or so, the internet came along and we suddenly had the ability for organizations to have direct contact with consumers. Actually, I'm going somewhere with this. I'm not going to go through the whole history of the internet here, but
of course.
But that was a big switch that people could interact directly with companies, and it causes lots of disintermediation or whatever. Okay.
Sure.
So now if we think about what's possible with artificial intelligence, and particularly with agents, is increasingly, I think, customers of a company may not be humans or may not be humans directly. So, on the one hand, we have the internet set up to let humans buy and retail and exchange business. I think it's really going to be interesting over the next decade as we transition from humans being able to interact with businesses to our agent level proxies being able to enter. And I think that's going to cause a lot of consternation, certainly in me, about how that's going to work. But I think that's a huge trend that we're about to see.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I see that too. And I think these AI agents will become more of an extendability to your own self in helping you to get information, to transact, to share information. But the question is, once we get so far down this rabbit hole, how do we know the truth behind what is being seen, what is being shown, what is being purchased? Meaning, is this a human person, or human entity? Is this an AI agent? Is this something else? We don't know. So, there will have to be some kind of a vetting process, especially as we're building relationships. I mean, if we don't know somebody for the first time and we're initiating, and we see that now with outbound sales as an example. We have these AI sales development representatives, what they call SDRs, right? This is a very big thing. It has been for a little while now, last couple of years or so, a few years, where they'll prospect, they'll try to engage somebody, and it could be anybody as a first entrance to a conversation. But usually they're very clear and very forward about it, especially now, because people want to make sure that there's still a human component there, that they're still transacting with a human. Now, in time, I feel that there'll be a farther and farther division, a great divide between what we see with these AI agents and what we see with humans, and the technology will rise, and there will have to be a level of protection in place here for those who really care about that. And I think the human first mindset will become a bigger thing. I actually saw something the other day. It was very interesting. It was done by AI. It was a little clip, and it was essentially a bunch of protesters protesting what AI has done to humans. But it was created by AI. It was fascinating. It was a really interesting take on this. I hadn't seen anything like that. And it just shows you where this is going, and it's not just the application of AI agents. It's not just influencers. It's not just sales and customer service. But I do think we're seeing some pushback, especially right now. I think it's not quite at the level yet earlier, right? Because there's a lot to figure out. So as an example, if we're talking about big name brands, Klarna, I believe, recently went through an exercise where they had 60% of their staff, right, that was canned, so to speak. And they brought in AI agents to replace the customer service side. But what we saw recently is a pushback. People did not like it. They were unhappy. So they brought those humans back. So I think we're going to see a lot of that until that adoption is ready, the technology level sets, and there's less resistance. And there's more of a scrutiny period where people feel comfortable to engage with the AI side. And there's maybe a little bit more reciprocity where, we're able to give and take, not just take from the AI to human conversations. So it's fascinating.
There's a whole bunch of stuff there. And I think one underlying huge principle here is that we're the first human civilization to ever deal with this technology.
Absolutely.
We can't look at the back of the book here. We don't know the right answers.
No.
And at the same time, it's happening, as you mentioned, very quickly.
Very quickly.
So the combination of new technology and very quickly makes there's going to be some missteps in the process.
Yeah.
But as I think about it, I'm hoping that we don't lose transparency as a big part of it. One of the analogies I like to make is that in 1906, Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle about the meatpacking industry. And it was exposing just how gross the food production process was and how it made people sick and et cetera, et cetera. And what happened from that book was a lot of transparency and a lot of inspection of food inspections, restaurant inspections, health inspections. And so now we have a very healthy supply chain of food in our country. And it's news when someone gets sick from food. It happens, but it's news.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
The analogy is that we just don't know what's going on inside most companies and most implementations of artificial intelligence. And I'm hoping that in this process, we can come up with processes to try to get a little bit more awareness about what's going on and transparency, because I think that's going to help mitigate some of these things you're talking about, this comfort level with artificial intelligence. If it's transparent, I think people will have more comfort for that. And, again, this is not the first time we've done this as humans.
Yeah.
We have CPAs inspect the books of companies before we buy stocks. We don't have to see the stocks, but we have CPAs. So there's a model.
Yep.
I used to work for the United Nations in the weapons inspection program. We have weapons inspectors who go in and look and verify that people are not making bombs.
Right.
And so the point is, we have technologies at our disposal that we can go out and inspect and look at things. And I think that's something that's missing right now from artificial intelligence, but we can do it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. No, I agree fully. What's one question more companies you think should be asking themselves before adopting AI, but they usually don't do that as of today?
When you think about an organization and their competitive advantage, people compete in some area. Whether if they're big on customer service. If you're big on customer service, then why are you sticking a chatbot on your website? There's a mismatch between what is your strength, your competitive, and the application of technology.
Right.
And every company is different in terms of what their competitive advantage is. Mm-hmm. But I think stepping back and saying, how does our strategy, particularly how we get advantage in the marketplace, align with the use of this technology?
Right.
And if, for example, something I kind of pick on is payroll. No, companies don't have competitive advantage in payroll. What you want is you want to pay people, you want it to be smooth process.
Yeah.
But no one goes and buys clothes from a company that has a really awesome payroll system, right? Yeah. It's just a mismatch. So that's a great place to put in technologies that are routine and even. Right. On the other hand, in places that you want to be better than average, then I think using these technologies only to the degree they help you be better than average is great. Because if everybody's using the same technology, then they're all going to be the same.
They're all the same. I mean, what makes you different? What makes you radically different at this point? Right. And that's the key. And I think, what makes you radically different goes in and outside of technology. Sometimes it is the technology. It is the actual, application utilization of technology, be it, you're a SaaS company and that is your core tech, be it you're a fintech company and that is your core mechanism of technology to drive financial transactions. It could be health technology where you've created this system by which hospitals are utilizing this tech in a very radical way. But you're right. If it's just to incrementally improve what you're doing categorically, eventually people will start to do the exact same thing. So how do you run outside of that? How do you, race in your own race and use technology to better improve and optimize, and in some cases radically differentiate? That's key.
Right. That differentiation, that radical differentiation, as you put it, is the key to becoming radical. Right.
It's the key. You're absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Well, this has been wonderful. I could go on and on for hours and hours and days about AI and technology and what's happening here with you, and nobody better than with you, because this has been a really thoughtful, meaningful conversation. We really appreciate you being here. Where's the best place for those listening to find you, to learn more about you? Is it the podcast that you co-host? Where can they look you up?
Yeah, so Me, Myself, and AI is the podcast, and that's a great start. And my last name, as you mentioned, is Ransbotham, and there's just not that many Ransbothams. If you have a very weird last name, as you know, you're easy to find. So check out the podcast, Me, Myself, and AI, and it's available through MIT Sloan Management Review.
Incredible. Well, thank you for being here today, Sam. We appreciate it. You're definitely becoming radical in all things that you do. We appreciate you being here today to talk to us about AI specifically, and the intersection of what's happening in the world of business as it extends out from the bottom to the top and all things in between. So thank you again, and we'll be following you along every step of the way.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Becoming Radical. If today's episode sparked something in you, follow wherever you listen, join the conversation, and share it with someone ready to think beyond limits. Be unlimited, be bold, and become radical. See you next time.